a noble knight, a hero of France, who fought alongside Joan of Arc. But behind the banners and armor hid a monster. Gilles de Rais was once one of the wealthiest, most respected nobles in France. A celebrated warrior whose courage on the battlefield helped lift the siege of Orléans, earning him honor and glory. But when the wars ended, and the crowds stopped cheering, Gilles turned inward, sinking into darkness. Behind the stone walls of his grand castles, he lured innocent children from the villages, promising them safety, food, or work. They never returned. What followed was a horror beyond imagination. Abduction, torture, ritualistic murder. A story of privilege twisted into evil, of faith turned to obsession, and of a knight whose true battle was with the monstrous darkness inside himself. Because history is darker than any horror story, and we must remember it. Gilles de Rais was born in 1405 in the heart of feudal France, into a world of cold stone castles, shifting loyalties, and brutal power struggles. His family, the House of Montmorency, Laval, was one of the wealthiest and most powerful noble lines in Brittany and Anjou, owning vast lands, countless serfs, and towering fortresses that cast shadows over the peasantry below. But even in wealth, his childhood was marked by turmoil. His father died when Gilles was around 10, reportedly in a hunting accident, leaving him and his younger brother Guy as orphans under the guardianship of their grandfather, John de Cron. His mother died soon after, leaving the young Gilles in a household consumed by inheritance disputes and political maneuvering. His grandfather, a cunning and ruthless man, recognized Gilles' value as an heir to the family's sprawling estates and power. Jean de Cron was determined to use Gilles to secure further alliances, arranging an early betrothal to a wealthy heiress to expand the family's influence. But these plans fell apart, leading to legal battles that would teach Gilles early on that power and wealth were as fragile as they were intoxicating. Despite these feuds, the de Rais fortune remained immense, and when Gilles came of age, he inherited a fortune so large it placed him among the richest men in France. He owned multiple castles, hundreds of square miles of land, and the income to support a courtly lifestyle of luxury, hunting parties, fine clothes, and endless feasting. But Gilles wasn't just a wealthy noble. He was raised in a world that demanded men of his status prove themselves on the battlefield. France was still clawing its way through the chaos of the 100 Years' War against England. And it was on these battlefields that Gilles first carved out his reputation. He became a respected knight, known for bravery and ferocity, riding at the head of charges, his armor glinting, his banner flying high, his sword drawing blood for the glory of France. Those who fought alongside him spoke of his fearlessness and commanding presence in battle, his willingness to lead from the front, and his almost theatrical taste for displays of wealth and power, dressing in rich souks beneath his armor, throwing lavish feasts even amidst the grime of war. His path intertwined with that of Charles VII, the Dauphin of France, and most famously, Joan of Arc. Gilles was among the noble commanders who supported the young peasant girl, claiming divine visions, fighting to lift the English siege of Orléans. At her side, he witnessed victories that turned the tide of war, moments that elevated Joan to sainthood and Gilles to the rank of Marshal of France, one of the kingdom's highest military honors. By his 20s, Gilles de Rais, everything a man of medieval Europe could desire: land, wealth, prestige, and glory earned in battle. Songs were sung of the knights who fought beside Joan, and Gilles stood among them, bathed in the respect of kings and the awe of commoners. Yet beneath the gold and glory, a darkness was growing, quietly festering in the depths of his lavish halls and restless mind. A hunger for something beyond wealth and war, a void that would soon drag him into the abyss. Because sometimes, the brightest banners hide the deepest shadows. Gilles de Rais' name became etched into the chronicles of French history during one of its darkest and most miraculous moments. The rise of Joan of Arc. In 1429, France was on its knees. The English and their Burgundian allies had seized large swaths of the kingdom, and the Dauphin Charles VI's claim to the throne teetered on the brink of collapse. The French people were weary, broken by war, famine, and defeat. Into this despair stepped a teenage peasant girl, claiming visions from God Joan of Arc. She convinced Charles to let her lead his armies, promising victory in the name of divine will. Many nobles doubted her, dismissing her as a mad child. But Gilles de Rais saw something different. A spark of hope, a chance for glory, and perhaps something more mysterious that drew him to her cause. When Joan took up her banner, Gilles de Rais was among the first high-ranking nobles to pledge his support, joining her at the siege of Orléans, where the French forces were surrounded, exhausted, and desperate. Gilles was not there merely as a figurehead. He led charges, organized assaults, and stood on the front lines beside Joan as arrows and stones rained down. Chroniclers noted Gilles' fearless presence, clad in shining armor, a plume on his helm, wielding his sword as he led men into the breach. Under Joan's spiritual leadership and Gilles' military command, the French forces fought with renewed fury, breaking the English siege and turning the tide of the war. The victory at Orléans was a moment of national resurrection, and Gilles de Rais was there for every step, earning the title Marshal of France for his service. He accompanied Joan during her campaigns to reclaim French territory, witnessing her charisma on the battlefield, the faith she inspired among common soldiers, and the near-mythical aura that grew around her. Gilles' loyalty to Joan was evident, and so was the admiration he received from his peers for his courage. But alongside these virtues, Gilles' flaws were impossible to ignore. He was known for his arrogance, demanding respect and deference, insisting on luxurious tents, grand banquets, and richly embroidered banners even amid war's chaos. His retinue was vast, his horses finely adorned, and his personal chapel traveled with him, complete with a choir, priests, and golden relics, showcasing a taste for grandeur that bordered on obsession. Yet, despite these extravagances, few could deny that Gilles de Rais was a warrior of formidable skill and unshakable bravery. His presence at Joan's side lent her cause legitimacy among the nobility, and together they carved a path of victories that would eventually lead Charles V to his coronation in Reims. But as the drums of war faded and France began to stabilize, the bond that had defined Gilles' purpose began to unravel. Joan was captured and burned at the stake in 1431, her ashes scattered, her voice silenced. Gilles was there to witness the downfall of the Maid of all Annes, the flames consuming the one who had once inspired him to believe in a holy cause. Without war to fight, without Joan's light to guide him, Gilles de Rais was left with a void that all his wealth and prestige could not fill. The knight who had ridden for faith and country now found himself wandering the halls of his castles, restless, unsatisfied, and haunted. Because while he was celebrated as a hero, darkness brewed beneath, a darkness that would soon reveal the monster hidden within the gilded armor of France's noble knight. When the clamor of war faded, and the cries of victory were replaced by the hollow silence of peace, Gilles de Rais returned to his sprawling estates. A hero without a war, a knight without a purpose. His castles, scattered across Brittany and Anjou, became the stages for a new kind of spectacle, one not of glory, but of decadence and darkness. Gilles was one of the wealthiest men in France, and he wielded that wealth like a sword. His halls were filled with silks, tapestries, gold chalices, and the finest wines. Feast after feast stretched late into the smoky candlelit nights, music echoing through stone corridors as entertainers, singers, and jesters performed to the delight of a man whose appetite for grandeur seemed unquenchable. He surrounded himself with a lavish court of artists, playwrights, and performers, even funding elaborate theatrical productions that drained his coffers. It wasn't enough to merely host a dinner. Gilles wanted opera, drama, spectacle, and the cost of these indulgences spiraled, consuming the vast fortune that war and inheritance had once provided. As debts mounted, Gilles became desperate to maintain the lifestyle he believed was his birthright. Selling lands, pawning valuables, and draining his treasuries, he still could not stop the tide of financial ruin. Lavishness had become his addiction, and no battle could save him from it. In this desperation, his mind turned to darker solutions. The medieval world was filled with whispers of alchemy, of hidden arts that promised gold conjured from lead, of potions and powders that could transform a pauper into a king. Gilles, with the arrogance of one who had once commanded armies, believed he could bend the supernatural to his will. He began employing alchemists, magicians, and charlatans, offering them gold and protection if they could provide what he needed most. The philosopher's stone, that mythical object that could transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal wealth. His castles became laboratories of blackened crucibles, bubbling concoctions, and cryptic symbols chalked onto cellar floors. Strange figures arrived under the cover of night, robed in secrecy, carrying grimoires and vials of mercury, sulfur, and blood. The rituals grew darker. Gilles' obsession with summoning demons and spirits became an open secret among his frightened staff and impoverished neighbors. It was whispered that he would offer prayers, incantations, and even sacrifices to infernal powers, promising allegiance if they would fill his empty coffers. The same boldness that had led him to charge into battle now drove him deeper into occultism, convinced that dark forces could restore his wealth and secure his power. Alchemists and necromancers promised him golden answers, but instead, they drained what remained of his fortune, offering him empty words and false hope. Behind the locked doors of candlelit chambers, the noble knight, who once fought for France, now invoked demons, standing in circles of salt and iron, calling for power in the dead of night. What began as the desperation of a bankrupt lord became the obsession of a man who would stop at nothing to reclaim the wealth slipping through his fingers. This descent into darkness, fueled by arrogance and a refusal to accept decline, opened the final door to the true horrors yet to come. For in his search for forbidden power, Gilles de Rais would discover the depths of depravity hidden within himself. A darkness far blacker than any alchemist's ink. A hunger that wealth alone could not satisfy. Because some monsters are not born on the battlefield. They are forged in the silence that follows, in the restless need for power when the cheering stops. Gilles de Rais' descent into darkness did not happen with a single act of violence, but with a slow unraveling of the last threads of humanity that held him tethered to the world of men. His obsession with alchemy and the occult had opened a void inside him, and into that void poured a hunger he could not explain. A craving for control, dominance, and blood. What began with lavish feasts and the desperation to reclaim wealth soon spiraled into something far darker, something monstrous. The children were the first to vanish. In the quiet villages surrounding Gilles' many castles, parents would watch their sons and daughters leave for the day, carrying baskets to gather firewood or to run errands, never knowing they would not return. At first, the disappearances were rare, a single child gone, a family torn apart by grief and fear. Rumors whispered in the market that wolves or bandits had taken them. But wolves did not ride out in fine clothes, accompanied by liveried servants. Wolves did not lure children with promises of work, food, or safety. Gilles' men, under his command, began to seek out children, targeting the poor and the voiceless. Boys were often chosen, aged between 6 and 14, though sometimes young girls would also vanish under the same grim circumstances. A servant would appear at a poor family's cottage, offering the promise of work in the Lord's household, a chance for the child to serve in the kitchens or as a page to be fed, clothed, and given a future. For peasant families scraping by on muddy farms, it was an impossible offer to refuse. Those children would walk toward the grand gates of Gilles' castles, eyes wide at the sight of towering stone walls, banners fluttering in the wind, and the promise of warmth and food. They would enter through the iron gates, never to walk out again. Inside, Gilles de Rais transformed from a fallen hero into a predator. Within the thick walls of his fortresses, in chambers lit by flickering torches and smoky candles, the children faced horrors beyond imagination. Some were dressed in fine clothes before their suffering began, a twisted parody of nobility and innocence. Others were stripped of everything, reduced to trembling, pleading voices that echoed off the cold stone. Gilles' cruelty was ritualistic, systematic, and shockingly calculated. The methods varied: beatings, torture, sexual violence, followed by murder, and sometimes the dismemberment of small bodies. It was not only the act of killing that fed the darkness within him, but the terror in their eyes, the begging, the final moments of hopelessness that seemed to grant him a twisted sense of power and satisfaction. The remains of these children were hidden, burned in the hearths of the castles, buried in shallow graves, or scattered in the surrounding forests. The stench of burning flesh would sometimes waft from the chimneys, dismissed by servants too terrified to speak, or explained away as the burning of refuse and animal remains. Rumors began to circulate. Villagers whispered of the Lord's strange habits, the shadows moving within the castle walls, the children who never returned. But Gilles de Rais was not a man easily questioned. His wealth, his titles, and his reputation as a marshal of France protected him. Even as parents pleaded for help, their cries were lost in the fear of speaking against a man whose power could crush them. And so, the disappearances continued. The peasants spoke of curses, of devils and dark spirits that roamed the lands, too afraid to believe the simpler, more horrifying truth, that a man once hailed as a hero of France had become something monstrous, a predator in fine clothes, a murderer hiding behind stone walls, and the memory of a battlefield glory long gone. Inside the castles of Gilles de Rais, the cold halls became tomes, the cries of the innocent absorbed into the ancient stones, never to be heard again. The knights who once raised their swords for justice were replaced by servants carrying small, lifeless bodies to hidden places, burying them beneath the earth or throwing them into the fire, hoping to erase the evidence of the nightmares unfolding behind closed doors. And all the while, Gilles watched, commanding, orchestrating, and feeding the darkness that had grown too powerful to control. The crimes had begun, and the monster within Gilles de Rais was awake, consuming the lives of the innocent and dragging a nation's hero deeper into infamy. Cut by cut, life by life, until there was nothing left but darkness. Inside the towering stone ells of Gilles de Rais castles, the world became a sealed chamber of terror, cruelty, and shadows that swallowed the innocent. The great halls that once echoed with the laughter of feasts and the clang of goblets now hid sounds far more dreadful. Muffled screams, the rattle of chains, the scrape of boots dragging small feet across cold floors, the hush of servants who dared not speak, and the hollow silence that followed when all was done. The ritual of horror, from trial records and confessions, both forced and voluntary. We know that Gilles' crimes were not haphazard murders in a moment of rage, but orchestrated acts of ritualistic violence. The children brought to him, often dressed in borrowed finery, were first coaxed with soft words, sweet foods, or false promises of kindness. In some instances, he would seat them at grand tables, their small hands trembling as they held goblets too large for them, unsure if they were honored guests or prey. Then the kindness would end. The torture chambers, hidden rooms within his castles, became torture chambers. Heavy wooden doors shut away the world, while Gilles and his accomplices, including men like Poitou and Henriette, prepared for the spectacle. The children would be stripped, tied to beds or wooden structures, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes forced to look into the eyes of the man who claimed their lives. Gilles' methods were coldly creative. Some were strangled slowly, released, then strangled again, a grotesque game that prolonged terror. Others were subjected to blade cuts, sexual assault, or mutilation. Their cries a dark symphony that resonated through the stone corridors. At times, Gilles would watch, detached yet fascinated, as the children suffered, and other times, he took direct part, his actions driven by a horrifying blend of lust, rage, and the thrill of domination. It was as though each act was an offering to the darkness within him, a sacrament to the twisted power he believed he held. There were rumors, never fully proven, that some of these acts carried an occult purpose, part of Gilles' lingering obsession with summoning demons or gaining infernal favor to reclaim his lost fortune and status. Whether or not he truly believed in these rituals, he used them as justification for the horrors he committed. Psychological descent. Gilles' mind was a labyrinth of rot. Once the celebrated hero, the Marshal of France, he became a predator who found pleasure in control and destruction, seeking to exert the ultimate power over life and death. His need to dominate, to inflict fear, to watch life slip away, was fueled by the emptiness left after war, his financial ruin, and a possible madness that consumed his sanity. It was not merely the act of killing that satisfied him, but the process of fear, humiliation, and the extinguishing of hope in the eyes of the innocent. Each death became a performance, a ritual where Gilles played the role of god and executioner. The accomplices. Gilles did not commit these atrocities alone. Henriette, Poitou, and other aides played their part, luring children, holding them down, cleaning the blood, disposing of bodies. Some did so out of fear, others out of loyalty, and perhaps some found their own dark fascination in the acts. Their silence and complicity allowed Gilles' horrors to continue for years without consequence. They helped burn the bodies in large fireplaces, the acrid smoke rising from the chimneys and blending with the mist over the forests. They dug shallow graves in the forests or disposed of remains in castle latrines and pits, erasing the evidence while the villagers outside wondered why the stench of burning flesh never seemed to fade. The communities left broken. Outside the castle walls, families were destroyed, left in a purgatory of grief and unanswered questions. Mothers waited at doorways for children who never returned. Fathers searched the forests, calling names into the fog, hoping to hear a small voice call back. They found nothing. In a society where speaking against a noble was unthinkable, the families of the missing lived in silent fear, suspecting the truth, but powerless to confront it. Rumors twisted into ghost stories to explain the missing, but deep down, the people Brittany and Anjou knew something monstrous was living among them, wearing the mask of a hero. In these villages, the laughter of children faded, replaced by watchful eyes and locked doors, but hunger often forced families to send children out for work or errands, risking the same fate. The darkness of Gilles de Rais' crimes spread like a plague, infecting the spirit of the land with fear and sorrow. A castle of shadows. As the years passed, Gilles' castles became mausoleums, their stones soaking in the screams of the innocent, each hidden chamber a tomb, each fireplace a crematorium. The wealth he had once squandered was gone, replaced by a new currency, the lives of the voiceless, traded for fleeting moments of twisted satisfaction. Gilles de Rais, once the shining knight who fought alongside Joan of Arc, had become a creature of the shadows, a cannibal of innocence, a predator who stalked the living within his own halls, hidden behind banners and titles. And, while the world outside continued with wars and politics, inside these walls, the true horror of medieval power revealed itself, showing that the darkest monsters in history are often those who walk the earth with crowns, armor, and banners, hiding their evil behind the illusion of nobility. As the terror within Gilles de Rais' castles grew, so did the whispers outside. For years, fear and power shielded Gilles, allowing the disappearances of children to continue unchallenged. Parents mourned in silence, priests whispered in confessionals, and rumors slithered through market stalls and taverns. But even the heavy mantle of a Marshal of France could not hide the stench of so much death forever. Local clergy began to take notice. Priests heard stories from grieving parents whose children had vanished after encountering Gilles' men. The sheer number of disappearances, paired with the superstitious dread that soaked the countryside, became impossible to ignore. At first, villagers believed these were the acts of bandits or the punishments of a wrathful god. But as the rumors converged, a dark truth began to form. The Bishop of Nantes, John de Malestroit, took particular interest in these rumors. The church was already wary of Gilles due to his flamboyant lifestyle, occult interests, and arrogant defiance of clerical authority. Reports of his continued association with alchemists and sorcerers made him an easy target for ecclesiastical suspicion. And the rumors of missing children were the final push. Quietly, the Bishop of Nantes launched an investigation, interviewing families, collecting stories, and gathering testimonies from those who had witnessed children being taken by Gilles' men. As the clerics pieced together the puzzle, they uncovered the pattern of disappearances that led back to Gilles' estates. Some of Gilles' lower servants, and those who had fallen out of favor with him, were approached. Under promises of spiritual absolution and protection, they began to speak, describing in hushed tones the horrors they had seen and the roles they were forced to play in the disposal of small, lifeless bodies. The courage of the clergy to pursue this investigation was extraordinary. They were challenging a man of immense power, wealth, and prestige, risking their positions and safety for justice in a time when accusing a noble was often a death sentence in itself. As the investigation deepened, Henriette and Poitou, Gilles' closest servants and accomplices, were captured and interrogated. Faced with torture, excommunication, and the promise of damnation, they confessed in detail to the crimes committed within the dark chambers of Gilles' castles. They described how children were lured, how Gilles delighted in torment, and how the bodies were disposed of. These testimonies, though horrific, were essential, painting a picture that could no longer be denied. In September 1440, Gilles de Rais was arrested while attending church at Saint-E-de-Mermort. It was a public spectacle. The once proud knight, the Marshal of France, surrounded and taken into custody, the murmurs of the gathered crowd mixing fear with vindication. He was charged not only with murder and abduction, but also with heresy, sodomy, and invoking demons, crimes that threatened both the laws of men and the laws of God. The inclusion of heresy was no accident. It ensured that the Church could hold him accountable, while severing the shield of nobility that had protected him. The trial was held under both ecclesiastical and secular authorities, and it drew crowds eager to glimpse the fallen hero. Gilles, defiant at first, tried to dismiss the charges, mocking the court with the arrogance that had long defined him. But the evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies of parents, the confessions of his accomplices, and the mounting stories of horror. Facing threats of torture and the looming fear of excommunication and eternal damnation, Gilles finally broke. He confessed in grisly detail, confirming the nightmares that had haunted the countryside. He described how he lured the children, how he committed acts of torture and murder, and how he sought occult powers to regain his wealth, all while hiding behind the stone walls of his estates. His confession shocked France, revealing the monster beneath the knight's armor, a man who had once stood beside Joan of Arc, now exposed as one of the most prolific child murderers in European history. The investigation and downfall of Gilles de Rais shattered the illusion of chivalric nobility, reminding the world that titles and glory could mask darkness unimaginable. The knight who had fought for France, who had ridden under banners of salvation, was dragged into the light, where his crimes were laid bare for all to see. His castles, once symbols of power and prestige, now stood as haunted tombs of countless innocent lives. His name, once spoken with respect, became synonymous with horror, a cautionary tale whispered across France: no man, no matter how noble, is above the consequences of evil. The trial of Gilles de Rais was one of the most shocking spectacles of medieval France, pulling back the heavy curtain of nobility to reveal the darkness hiding within one of the nation's supposed heroes. News spread like wildfire across Brittany and Anjou that the mighty Marshal of France, the celebrated knight who once fought beside Joan of Arc, was accused of unspeakable crimes against children. For peasants who had lived in fear, watching children vanish without explanation, it was both vindication and terror to see the truth emerge. People crowded the streets and squares near the court at Nantes, whispering about the monster in noble robes, their curiosity mixing with dread. Some came to see justice. Others came simply to see what a monster looked like when stripped of power. Gilles de Rais was tried under two courts simultaneously: the ecclesiastical court of the church and the secular court of the Duke of Brittany's representatives. This was unusual, but necessary due to the scale of the crimes and their nature: heresy, witchcraft, sodomy, and the brutal murders of countless children. The church sought to excommunicate him for heresy, sorcery, and invoking demons, while the secular court pursued charges of murder, abduction, and sexual crimes against minors. This dual approach ensured that neither religious authority nor secular power could be accused of shielding him, and it underlined the seriousness of the case. The precise number of Gilles de Rais victims will never be known, but trial testimonies, confessions, and investigations estimated between 80 to 200 children were abducted, abused, and murdered under his command. Some estimates went higher, but even the lower numbers were horrific enough to stain Gilles' name for eternity. Parents testified to the last time they saw their children alive. Neighbors spoke of children led away by Gilles' men, and accomplices described the disposal of bodies and the monstrous acts that preceded the murders. The stories were consistent, village after village, name after name, building a mountain of horror too large to ignore. Gilles de Rais was erratic throughout the proceedings, a man at war with himself as the walls of his life crumbled. At times, he was defiant, insulting the court, mocking the proceedings, and leveraging his noble status in an attempt to intimidate judges and clerics. He scoffed at the accusations, claiming ignorance, calling the proceedings a farce, and demanding respect as a Marshal of France. At other times, the weight of his actions, and the threat of torture, excommunication, and the loss of his soul crushed him into tearful remorse. He confessed in detail, describing how he lured children, what he did to them, and how he disposed of their bodies. He wept openly, falling to his knees before the court, begging God for forgiveness and expressing terror at the eternal damnation awaiting him. His confessions shocked the courtroom, and many in attendance wept or turned pale at the details, unable to comprehend how a noble knight could commit such horrors. The court found Gilles de Rais guilty on all counts: murder, sodomy, heresy, and invoking demons. His noble title, military accomplishments, and once vast wealth could not save him now. The sentence was clear: death by hanging and burning, the punishment for crimes of this magnitude. The church delayed excommunication so Gilles could die within the faith, allowing him to confess and receive absolution before execution to save his soul, despite the monstrous nature of his crimes. With the verdict, France was forced to acknowledge the dark truth: a hero of the 100 Years' War, a man once celebrated for his valor and loyalty, was in reality a predator of the worst kind, hiding behind stone walls and banners of nobility, while he destroyed the lives of countless innocents. The trial of Gilles de Rais became a chilling reminder that evil can wear the face of honor, that monsters are not always found in forests or under beds, but sometimes in castles, clothed in titles, and riding beside saints. The day of his execution would become the final act in this dark saga, drawing crowds to witness the fall of a man who had once been a hero, now revealed as one of history's most infamous murderers. On October 26, 1440, the end came for Gilles de Rais. At a field outside Nantes, a scaffold and pyre were prepared. The man who had once ridden in gleaming armor, beside Joan of Arc, now stood in chains, clothed in the humility of a penitent. Stripped of his titles and power, he was to be hanged, and then his body burned, a punishment meant to cleanse the land and spare it of the horrors he had inflicted. Gilles was given the opportunity to confess and receive last rites, ensuring his soul could be saved according to church doctrine, despite the monstrous crimes he had committed. Accounts say he climbed the scaffold calmly, prayed fervently and wept, asking for forgiveness before the crowd. As the executioner carried out the sentence, the gathered spectators, peasants, clergy, and nobility, watched in tense silence, a mix of relief, horror, and grim fascination. The man who once symbolized the might of France burned away in smoke, the fire rising into the cold morning air. For the people of Brittany and Anjou, the execution was both a moment of justice and a source of deep unease. There was relief that the terror that haunted villages and stole children away had finally ended. But there was also a profound horror that a marshal of France, a knight of noble blood, had committed such atrocities for so long without consequence. Many struggled to reconcile the image of the valiant knight with the reality of the child murderer, forcing communities to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil could wear the mask of heroism. After Gilles' death, legends quickly grew around his story. In some tales, he was painted as a man who made deals with the devil, selling his soul in exchange for wealth and power. Others speculated he was a victim of political conspiracy, his wealth and lands too tempting for powerful figures to ignore. Though historical evidence overwhelmingly confirms his guilt, the extremity of his crimes made it difficult for some to accept, birthing myths of possible innocence, hidden conspiracies, or demonic possession that blurred the truth in local folklore. In Breton villages, parents told stories of Gilles as ghost haunting the ruins of his castles, searching for children to steal, a medieval boogeyman warning children to behave or risk being taken by the Bluebird Lord. Gilles de Rais is widely believed to have inspired the Bluebird folktale, the story of a wealthy nobleman who murders his wives and hides their bodies in a locked chamber. The folktale transformed the real-life horror of Gilles' murders into a cautionary fairy tale about curiosity and the hidden darkness behind wealth and power. His case also became one of Europe's earliest true crime fascinations, with chroniclers and storytellers retelling the fall of a knight who became a monster, shaping how societies understood and narrated the concept of a serial killer long before the term existed. The execution of Gilles de Rais closed a chapter of fear, but opened a darker reflection on human nature, power, and depravity. His story remains a chilling reminder that no title or status can hide the capacity for evil, and that history's monsters are often those we least expect. The castles he once ruled became ruins. The lands once under his control moved on. But his name endured, etched forever into history not as a hero of France, but as one of its darkest nightmares. Power, privilege, and darkness often walk hand in hand. Gilles de Rais was a paradox, a celebrated knight and war hero who became a serial child murderer, proving that even the brightest banners can hide the deepest shadows. As we remember his horrific crimes, it is the stolen lives of his victims that deserve to be remembered, not just the infamy of their killer. History is dark, and we must remember it.